Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 26th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, as always, I'd like to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible. Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I have the bandwidth to make this show now in its 7th year. And I wouldn't be able to do it at all without the support of amazing listeners just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, or you can visit the website of the podcast, talknerdy.com. This week, I want to thank Mary Neva, Rob Schreck, Pasquale Gelati, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Dudas Infinitus, June Sapara, Ulrika Hagman, and Robert Christ for their support of the show. All right, let's talk about this week's episode. So I had an opportunity to connect with Dr. Narissa Bax all the way from the Falkland Islands. She has a long history of working on around Antarctic waters with a focus on biodiversity and conservation. Right now, she's focused she's stationed actually within the Falklands in marine protected areas. And she has kind of a subspecialty in deep sea coral. So she's looking at this seafloor biodiversity and conservation and some of the incredible consequences, I guess we could say, of making sure that these ecosystems remain healthy. She is currently the Marine and Coastal Program Coordinator for the South Atlantic Environmental Research Group in the Falkland Islands, and she's also a researcher at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and the Center for Marine Socio-Ecology in Tasmania. Just an incredible story. I learned an awful lot from our chat, and I know that you will too. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Narissa Bax. Well, Narissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Cara. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am excited to be hosting you on your first ever podcast. This is a very exciting time. I hope that this experience is positive for you and you go on to do many, many more podcasts and share with the world the incredible work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Cara. That's lovely to hear. I hope so too.
Of course. And so I'm trying to remember how we first were connected. I don't know if it was, if somebody recommended you to the show or not, but I'm really excited the minute that I read your bio and I read all about the work that you do, I was like, I have to get her on my show. Number one, because very often on Talk Nerdy, I rely on pitches from publicists and things like that. And so it's very common that I have writers on the show because writers often are lucky enough that their publishing houses have a publicity arm and they pitch, these books to different outlets. And then it comes across my desk and I go, oh, what a good book. I can't wait to talk about this with the person who wrote it. And sometimes those writers are themselves scientists. But it's rarer that I have the opportunity to connect directly with somebody who is like boots on the ground doing really interesting scientific work. And probably what we should say right at the top is that our connection may not be great and the recording quality might not be amazing because you are very far away from me right now. I'm here in LA and where are you?
I'm in the middle of the Southwest Atlantic in a place called the Falkland Islands.
And tell us a little bit about the Falklands. I know, it's a word that most people have heard. Oh, I've heard of the Falklands, but then they're like, wait, where exactly is that?
So the Falklands is in a really unique geographic position because it's quite isolated between the bottom of the South Atlantic, the Cape Horn, Argentina, Chile, the Patagonian Shelf area, and then from there, you go onwards towards the Scotia Arc and the subantarctic and Antarctica. So a lot of research will either come via the Falkland Islands and go to places like South Georgia. A lot of the research ships will stop here, and it has a long history in terms of Antarctic exploration and being a centre point for that as well. But from an evolutionary point of you have some really interesting connectivity between marine environments in South America, in the Antarctic and subantarctic, and in the Falkland Islands, where it sort of merges into quite a unique, endemic, biodiverse ecosystem.
Oh, very cool. And when we think about Antarctica as a continent, as an ecological niche, as just a part of our globe that's often kind of ignored, that we often, I think, overlook. Um, there are these different points of entry, right? So the Falklands, as you mentioned, are kind of at the bottom, or sort of off to the bottom of the of like Patagonia, of these areas that we often think of as taking off points to Antarctica. But there are also entry points sort of on the New Zealand side of the map.
Well, yeah, if you go back in time and think more from a Gondwanan point of view, it's quite interesting of places that I've been lucky enough to work and to research, but also places that I've been lucky enough to live and to grow up. So I was born in New Zealand, and I spent the last about 12 and a half years living in Tasmania, and I've done a lot of work in Patagonia and the subantarctic, and now live in the Falkland Islands. And there's really beautiful, interesting connections across all of those places when you think about how the land masses were once connected during Gondwana land. And you can see that as you travel through these places from a terrestrial standpoint, but you can also see and think about those connections on the sea floor, which is something that I find incredibly interesting.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's sort of where we kind of move from your upbringing into your work, right? Is that you grew up in New Zealand, as you mentioned. Did you go to school in New Zealand, or did you travel for your education?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, something that I find very interesting when I try and think back across my life and my path, because I don't think that it's quite common for our generation, especially, to not necessarily have this very linear, you study one thing, go straight into the workforce, and you become a professional in your field. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And there's definitely points in terms of growing up somewhere like New Zealand where you're always connected to the ocean. You're surrounded by this understanding of how isolated you are and how beautiful the natural environment is and how unique the animals that live there are. And you learn a lot about that in school, which is really wonderful. But in terms of figuring out a career path from that, I think there's quite a few barriers that I understand that I encountered, but can look back and go, I overcame that for various reasons. But there's certain things in terms of, if you go to a rural school, for example, as opposed to a city school, you have different resources available to you and you'll see the world differently. And so New Zealand is predominantly rural, and a lot of my education was in rural environments. It was quite a transitory life. And so there were certain barriers to that, which meant that I went to a lot of schools and I came out not necessarily feeling like I would go to university or do anything like that. But then there's another, I guess, side of something that's quite reminiscent of our generation, that we had so much access to traveling the world. And so I left New Zealand and I got to, figure out what that meant. And so went to certain places that maybe weren't what I would love and enjoy now, but eventually found my way through these incredible places like in Southeast Asia. I started diving, and it also, travel opens your eyes to what is possible in the world, but also what is possible within you. And so I ended up, I guess, through that process, and especially through being able to dive in really beautiful places like Indonesia and the Philippines, feeling that I would take that shot, and I would see what it would be like to pursue my dream of being a marine biologist. And so I went back to New Zealand after 4 years of travel and started to pursue that through an educational pathway.
I love that. And so is a big part of the actual work that you do, and we'll get to the actual, I guess, research questions that you're asking, and what some of the evidence that you've gathered has shown, but is a big part of your work literally gearing up and going on dives, like something that you both enjoy personally and professionally?
I think that that is something that I feel lucky for every day, is that I've managed to have a career that also fulfills all of the things that I am passionate about. And, to some degree, depending on what I'm working on, it's kind of going to work will be like going to the beach. You're doing exactly what you enjoy. And there's also, especially to work somewhere like Antarctica or the subantarctic, it's so much about discovery and these incredible research expeditions where you're surrounded by a wealth of expertise and knowledge. Uh, yeah, and so a lot of my passions, I guess, will align quite readily with the career that I have. So things like diving are probably the obvious one. I also very much love being at sea and on the ocean. So sailing and working on ships has been a huge highlight of my career. And, just more simple things sometimes too, that idea of it's kind of like a treasure hunt when you're going through all the animals that come up from the sea floor and trying to figure out what they are and how they're related and what it means is something that you can get really lost in as well.
Yeah. It's funny because I find, and I don't know, this is definitely an outsider's perspective because I am not necessarily the seafaring type. Um, but I find in my friends and colleagues who are marine researchers, that there's kind of a type. It's like it's people who love the open ocean and who love to dive and who love to be out on boats and who really enjoy spending time in some of these remote places, that it feeds them a little bit, like it feeds their soul. Do you identify with that?
Oh, yeah. And I think that's been a large part of the process of figuring out where in the world I would like to work during the process that I've recently been on. That's been the highest priority, is to be somewhere with high biodiversity and access to wildlife and remote. And there's also that coinciding theme of, unfortunately, in the world we have declining biodiversity and we have climate change, and so there's certain areas of the world that you can work in that will also be quite hard to work in to some degree, because you end up documenting the decline of the ecosystem that you're working on. And long term, that takes a real toll. And there's something much more fulfilling about working somewhere where you have the capacity to positively influence conservation, but also to witness the biodiversity that we have in the world.
Yeah. So why don't we dive into that a little bit? Because that really is your focus, right? It's a specific focus on these marine environments, and both biodiversity and conservation are at the forefront. And then, if you were to talk about a kind of a subspecialty within that, you're looking at coral, and coral is so interesting because coral is not just its own organism, but it's its own organism that flourishes within its own ecosystem, like it's a kind of an anchor in this ecosystem, and it gives us a lot of insight about the health of the ocean, kind of at a larger scale, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what you're bringing to the forefront there is that idea of how they can be like an ecological model to understand patterns of the ocean and to understand interconnectedness and isolation. And corals are known as one of the many animals that are considered ecosystem engineers, and so they support the surrounding ecosystem through their structure, but also through recycling nutrients. And one of the larger projects that I'm involved on is quantifying the contribution of blue carbon in Antarctic ecosystems. And so blue carbon is often associated with other ecosystem engineer types like mangroves and seagrass and kelp forests. And in these benthic ecosystems, you have very different compositions. So you'll have sponges and corals and bryozoans. And what ends up happening when we're thinking about long-term carbon sequestration is that these animals, when they're buried below the oxygen layer in the sediment, they're locked away. And so that carbon dioxide is also locked away for potentially hundreds or thousands of years, which is a very important ecosystem service for the planet and for functioning more broadly. And what we're seeing in the Antarctic context is that this ecosystem service is increasing in some locations, in some areas, as a consequence of climate change. And so it's actually considered a negative feedback on climate change. It's a nature-based solution to climate change. So it's quite interesting, important ecosystem to study from that point of view as well.
Oh, okay. So kind of just take a step back and to focus maybe for a minute on these different, I guess, animals that are living on the sea floor, specifically corals, but other different animals on the sea floor. Coral is an animal. I think a lot of people might not know that. So tell me a little bit more about coral, like what coral is.
Oh, it's so common. People are quite surprised, especially that they're the Antarctic corals. And so a lot of that is because you become familiar with what you can see and what you can be close to. And so the tropical corals are what people generally, what generally comes to mind. And tropical corals are part animal, part zooxanthellae. And the zooxanthellae is the algal cells that photosynthesize. Whereas in deep waters, and I think the statistic is something like 2/3 of the corals that we have in the world are deep sea cold water corals. And so they live in environments where there isn't any light. So the corals I work on in Antarctica are often around 500 meters below the surface, and they are purely the animal skeletal component. So they don't have algal cells because they have no reason to photosynthesize. And so what they feed on is all the particulate matter that falls from the ocean surface. So they're filter feeders. And there's a whole community composition of filter feeders down there in these environments. It's like a city of corals and sponges and bryozoans and sea stars and polychaetes and sea cucumbers, all sort of taking advantage of the currents and the nutrients in those environments.
Mm-hmm. It's very cool. And so then you mentioned sort of the ecosystem role, and it's not obviously the only ecosystem role that they serve, but one of the important roles from a climate change perspective is this idea that they sequester carbon. So actual carbon molecules are being held onto and trapped down at the ocean floor. And that's important because as we see carbon going into the larger ocean, we actually see that the larger ocean becomes more acidic because when you add carbon to water, you form carbonic acid.
Yeah, exactly. So nothing in the ocean can easily be extrapolated and teased apart. We've got so many interacting factors. And what you're talking about with ocean acidification is particularly important to animals like corals because they have calcium carbonate skeletons, and with a decreasing pH, it compromises the integrity of their structure and of these ecosystems. And there's also the process is being observed to happen faster in cold waters. So the polar regions are considered most vulnerable to ocean acidification. And it is particularly important depending on which strategy certain animals use as well. And so the corals I work on, and corals more broadly, often use aragonite, but there's other polymorphs that they will use. And so the corals I work on have this interesting strategy where they can use both. So calcite is the other one. And in the ocean, you have what's known as a saturation horizon. And so the saturation horizon for aragonite is shallowing quite. It's predicted to be in surface waters by 2100. And so what that means is that below this region, certain animals won't be able to calcify. And so if it's going to be in surface waters, that's going to possibly create a very different community composition. And we may have winners, we may have losers, and it's possible that some of the corals that I'm working on will have a higher chance of survival because the calcite saturation horizon is deeper.
I see. So tell me, I mean, just maybe kind of a silly question, but it might also be a question on the tips of some people's tongues. Why is calcification important? I mean, is it fundamental to the survival of many of these creatures? Like they need to be able to calcify their shells in order to exist, right?
Yeah, well, when you think of something like a coral, it's very pertinent. You can imagine the skeleton, and without the skeleton, there's not necessarily a lot left. But there are some super interesting studies on more tropical environments where they have managed to change the pH and run these experiments where they put a certain species, and I can't remember which one it is, but in a lower pH, and it reverts to more of an anemone state. So it stops having a skeleton and ends up existing as an anemone type structure.
Oh, wow. So it can still survive.
Yeah. So a lot of what we as scientists, we really want the world to persist, right? Like we want to understand these systems and how we can prepare for the future and what may come. And so this example, I learned about at a conference at the beginning of my career, and it did really inspire me at the time because it also showed that when you put that species of coral back into the pH of a healthy, functioning ocean, it was super interesting that coral actually recalcified. And so some animals have, a higher capacity to acclimate to certain environments.
Mm, yeah. So is the function, like, how does the actual carbon become sequestered? Is it really just like a function of gravity that these things are happening on the seafloor and they're getting buried as things, like, I don't know, die? How does the carbon get so low and then actually get trapped? Is it really just sequestered in the skeletal components of their shells, or is it actually getting buried then under the seafloor as well?
Well, so the really interesting thing is when you kind of level that up and look at the carbon cycle in the ocean and all of the animals that are a part of it. And so you have on the surface water, you have the phytoplankton, the kind of algal component, and then that goes through the ecosystem and other animals like the krill or the fish or the octopus. It will go into their bodies. And then eventually, through the process, you end up on the sea floor with these biodiverse communities taking in what's come through the cycle from there. And so they immobilize it within their skeleton. And so throughout this process, carbon is being removed at various stages, but it's still in the carbon cycle for most of that. And in terms of climate change mitigation, what you really want to focus on is taking that carbon out of the carbon cycle and locking it away. And so this happens when the animals die and they're buried, and it's a long-term process, and it's part of the natural functioning of these ecosystems. And in order for that to happen effectively, maintaining the integrity of biodiversity is really fundamental as well. So there's certain things that we have in the world that can remove biodiversity. So impacts of fishing, or the unknowns about ocean acidification and warming and that sort of thing. And so really figuring out how to mitigate what would be those immediate impacts. And we have strategies like marine protected areas and or multi-use areas where having sustainable fisheries is prioritised. Those sorts of conversations are what we try to do to protect the functioning of these ecosystems.
And I think that sort of brings us to an important transitional point, that not only are you boots on the ground doing the type of field work and research that requires that you actually physically take these samples, that you observe these areas, that you figure out ways to then measure these samples, compare them to previous rates. I mean, there's a lot of complicated process that goes into physically doing the field work, but you also are now connecting the knowledge that you're gaining from this field work to policy, to real world action. You're saying, look, I'm seeing what's happening in these remote places that are a litmus test for the globe as a whole. We need to be doing something about this.
Yeah, so that's been the main focus for the last couple of years, especially from my leadership roles within the broader project. So we partnered with a governance and law policy team in Tasmania as well to sort of look at, because Antarctic is not just unique in terms of the ecosystem and the global importance to broader ocean functioning and health. It's also a very unique governmental system based around collaboration. There's a number of nations within the Antarctic Treaty System, and you have something as beautiful as the Antarctic Treaty System, which is has designated Antarctica as a place for peace and science. And then we also, this is the first year of what is known as the Ocean Decade for Sustainable Science. And so there's a huge collaborative movement to coordinate efforts that are going to result in positive changes for humanity and for the ocean and for biodiversity conservation. And so it seems very timely to condense the knowledge that we have and figure out how to progress that into broader areas of governmental change and conservation long term.
Oh, I mean, it's so important. And I can imagine that may be an unintended / intended, maybe in parentheses, intended consequence of the work that you've mentioned and these treaties and these kind of international collaborations, is that there's real diplomacy happening here, that maybe nations who have conflicts in other areas are working together for a sort of broader goal. And I think it's really cool when or maybe it's a really positive benefit on something that often we can think is a little bit bleak, when we see that that science does often bring many people together across geopolitical boundaries.
Oh yeah, and that has been something that is a true highlight of my life working in Antarctica. It is a very collaborative space. You have international voyages and nations. I've lived at the French research station. I've worked in Antarctica on a Russian ship. I've been with the Australian program, with the American program. In part it's because it's so expensive. It's so difficult to access the ecosystem. So the imperative is, you have to collaborate. You're not going to get anywhere or do anything effective if you don't. And so it creates yeah, a very interesting international network of researchers and capacity. It's phenomenal from that standpoint.
I mean, it's just so fundamentally important. I have to, sorry, this might be kind of a weird aside, but I have to tell you, I've been playing around the whole time we've been talking on Google Earth, looking at the Falklands, because I'm just fascinated. I'm just fascinated by like how remote they really are, how much of it is, not obviously clearly undeveloped. But there is this. I finally found. I was like, where are the people? And I finally found Stanley, and it seems like there's like a mini city.
Yeah. So I live in Stanley, which is the epicenter of life in the Falkland Islands. I think the population more broadly is about 3,500, possibly.
Oh wow, okay. There's an airport.
There is. The majority of people live in Stanley. And, something that I've found really beautiful since I've been here is just how accessible it is to, 10 minutes from town, there is this beautiful penguin colony. So the photo that I sent you is taken from the penguin colony. And it's an area so the Falkland Island has quite an interesting history of war as well. And so in November last year, it was the first time since the war that all of the landmines had been cleared from the islands. And so there's this particular beach called York Bay where it was, people hadn't walked on this beach for close to 40 years. And so the entire town, I think, I wasn't here in November, walked down on that beach to sort of have that experience of what it was like to walk where they hadn't been allowed to for so long. But what we also have in that beach is this really beautiful example, and it's hard to tell because you don't have the counter example, you just have the one, right? But there are literally hundreds of penguins there. You can see sea lions sort of stalking along in the waves, and there was a fur seal cub down there the other day. There's dolphins swimming nearby. We had the most whales that have ever been sighted in the Falkland Islands a few weeks ago, and those whales were so numerous that you didn't necessarily know where to look. And they were so close to shore.
Oh, wow.
You can hear them, and you can just sort of walk along the beach and follow the whales as you're walking. And it's such a special, beautiful place. But it's also possibly, and like I say, we don't have the counterexample, but it's possibly because it's an area that's been shut off to people. And, the true test over time is going to be how people behave going into those environments, because the hope is that we can have this place long term, that we won't impact it and that it will continue. And yeah, sadly, there's been that sort of coinciding with my career, with our lifetime, seeing certain places disappear, and you don't get them back once they're gone very easily.
What a incredible experience, an incredible opportunity to kind of have this stratified, this multi-layer, I guess, I don't know, I keep saying the word experience over and over, but absorption of the biodiversity of the the plants and the animals, but also the people and the history of such it's, I think, coming from somebody who's living here in Los Angeles, and of course people who are listening to the show are all over the world. Many of them, though, are in the US, in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, English speaking countries. And I think we feel so remote from our planet. And it sounds like not just throughout your academic life, but kind of throughout your life as a whole, have been in many ways confronted by our home in a way that I can imagine that you just have a very different perspective than I do, living in sort of my concrete paradise.
Yeah, and I wonder about that sometimes because, we all have that that feeling that how we see the world is possibly similar to how others see the world, but it's not necessarily the case. And I can see myself where we started in our conversation, sort of talking about growing up somewhere like New Zealand, for example. And I know that if I had stayed in New Zealand and never travelled the world and never seen these comparisons, I wouldn't have the same perception. And I guess also that, you know, my life has exceeded any expectation that I could have for it. I wasn't, when I first got introduced to you, I wasn't even certain I would continue in science. And now I've actually ended up in this, yeah, wonderful job in this wonderful location. And it creates a perspective towards the future that I guess is quite unique, because I'm doing something that I hope will have a positive contribution in the world to, that comes from a place of genuinely wanting to, for not only broader issues of biodiversity conservation, but also, I've created this life where I'm quite tied to being in those locations and caring about, what happens in the long term. It's been, I guess, also these kinds of thoughts that a lot of people, well, I would project that possibly a lot of people, with how the world just changed in the last couple of years, have started to recognise how important our natural environments are.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I think, and it's not just a conversation about, we go back a lot of times to almost to the point where it starts to feel like a meaningless term to many people who are so concerned with just getting through their day. But, it's not just about climate change per se. It's not just about the treacherous impact that we've had on our global environment, on the global climate, on global ecology. But I think it also, I don't know, the quote climate, to use that term in a different context, of right now, especially here in America, is one of like increasing income inequality. I think that there's been a really, and I don't know how quickly the news comes there in the Falklands, but this very strange time where people are dying in droves of a preventable disease, yet there are, billionaires who are, taking suborbital flights to space for fun. And a lot of people, have different views on this. And I think we're very excited about the fact that the science will bring an orbital perspective. And we're very excited about the fact that the science maybe get some technological advancements, but at the same time, there's a salt being rubbed in the wounds of many people who are just trying to survive. And when we bring that humanity back into the conversation, I think one of the ways that we can really do it is by going outside and being in the world, being of the world, and feeling what that feels like. So many of us are disconnected from that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're also touching on there is, that we live in an unequal world, and there's a very different, strategy and recommendations and capacity if you were to. The kind of work that we can do, say, in the Falkland Islands would be very different to the kind of work that I did in Myanmar, for example. And also, the expectation that and the assumptions that we make need to be really carefully managed in those environments. And Myanmar is come forward as quite the stark example, I guess, for me, because I lived and worked there for a while, but also more broadly because the issues of poverty and of not good governance. There's you need those factors in place to be effective, and it's not like you can focus all or nothing on any one area. And the kinds of where I was working in the Delta, for example, they had this really like quite extreme. The people that are most impacted by the consequences of climate change, for example, are, also they're so close to the issue that there was no one in the Delta, for example, that didn't believe in climate change. Everyone would talk about it as an issue, and they had this extreme example where a cyclone came through, and the houses and the people that were protected by the mangroves were the ones that survived, and those areas where they had degraded mangroves didn't. But it doesn't change the broader issue of food security being the highest priority for everyone there, and it creates a global complexity around what we can do and where we need to focus our efforts. And it's an unrealistic expectation to put that pressure on many individuals in the world that are, especially now, very impacted by economic hardship as well.
Yeah, an example that I brought up recently on the other podcast that I work on, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And the reason I bring it up is because it's an example that slapped me in the face and hit me, and based on my data that the vast majority of my listeners are here in the States, I think it's one that might speak to them as well. I was watching a beautiful documentary that was just recently put out by Amir Thompson, otherwise known as Questlove, from The Roots. He's a musician and a DJ, and a drummer and a DJ, but also somebody who is very dialed into music culture in our country, historical music culture, and also very specifically African American music culture. And he recently put out a documentary called Summer of Soul. And long story short, it's this documentary based on a soul festival that was put on in Harlem in 1969. So if we think about the climate of the United States in 1969, it was a year after we lost MLK. We also lost Bobby. Previous to that, we had lost Bobby Kennedy. Previous to that, we had lost Malcolm X, and not long before that was JFK, and there was some real turmoil. There was a real social inequity. It's kind of like peak civil rights, and there was this, expression of joy and expression of love, but also of community and frustration and protest at this beautiful soul festival that featured all the greats of the time, Gladys Knight and the Pips and Stevie Wonder and all of these incredible musicians. And there was a reporter on the ground because at the exact same time that this soul festival was going on, the Apollo program had happened, and we landed on the moon, and this reporter went around to these Harlem, many of whom lived in Harlem. Some of them came in right from surrounding areas, but these Harlem residents at this soul festival, and I was like, we landed on the moon. What do you have to say about that? And their responses, in a way, I mean, it really shows my privilege and my disconnect from this era, because I was born after this era. They almost surprised me, and I'm almost frustrated with myself that they did surprise me. But the answers were like, okay, good for the white man. This doesn't affect me. This feels like a waste of money. This feels like a slap in the face. We have our brothers and sisters starving in the streets, and this doesn't speak to me. And I think we see a recapitulation of this now. Oh, by the way, the reason the documentary is so wonderful is that this footage was all buried. This footage never made it to air. Nobody, aired it on television. Nobody really wanted to purchase this, like they called it the Black Woodstock. And it was in a basement for decades until Amir found it and actually built this documentary around it, kind of showing it the light of day again. But it just reminded me how important it is to keep our eye on a larger global perspective, and to remember that our frame is not the same as the person right next door's frame, and it's definitely not the same as the frame of somebody across the globe. who comes from a different background than us, who comes from a different amount of privilege and a different amount of experience, or just a different experience, not a different amount of experience. But it speaks, I think, so drastically to what you're saying about your kind of being in the world, and how when you were in Myanmar, the things that you were, the judgments you were making, and the ways that you were feeling compassionate about the work that you do, it was fundamentally different than the way it is now in the Falklands.
Yeah, and I think, that's the example that you use is bringing up that idea of, who gets to be at the table and who gets to be a part of the conversation, and who we engage with and who listens at the time. And it's hard to know. I mean, I really hope that it is changing from 1969, which was the time period that you were talking about, but maybe not fast enough. We still hear less from women, less from minorities, less from Indigenous scholars, less from those that are actually impacted in developing nations, and there needs to be, I think, a broader focus on not just the advocacy for wanting to hear those voices, but for providing the supports that are needed to enable those people to get to that point. That example, it's because you also used that idea of how the person they interviewed said something along the lines of, that's, good for the white man type of thing. And we have this, especially working in developing countries, and, now I'm working in a British overseas territory, there are issues of colonization and colonialism that we need to address as well. And, even thinking back to my time in Myanmar, so that was in 2016, and I have a friend that she works a lot in, disaster relief, like a Doctors Without Borders type of capacity. And she told me about this trope that it conjures up an image. It's a caricature, but the trope that she put forward was this idea of the great white savior. And it's, we're often, unfortunately, still running on that model where, someone from a foreign country will come over and study or have a field season, and not necessarily linking how important it is to, rather than take that approach, to really capacity build on the ground. And there was an interesting article that came out last year along those lines, around the time of, because we're also living in a world where it's much harder to travel, it's much harder to do your field work. And so we're learning all these lessons, unfortunately, possibly too far down the line, when we could have mitigated that and really focused in on, because it's not, I don't know whether it would necessarily, if we use your Apollo moon landing example, that, people can get behind the idea of space, I imagine. I mean, there's a lot of contexts where, so deep sea science, which I work in, has a similar, kind of out of sight, out of mind disconnect about it. But it is something that should be there and intriguing to everyone. And I don't think that, a lot of that is about the people that end up accessing it. And we have all of those issues and patterns that transcend across science as well, in terms of the legacy of who ends up engaging in this type of research and in these locations. And I think it's a very important, parallel issue to tackle, the equity behind who's involved in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the problem isn't with space. The problem isn't with what's going on in the deep ocean. The problem is who has access to this information, and who has access to, and not just access, who's empowered to be involved. And like you said, who has a seat at the table. And it's not just about, as you mentioned, saying, well, here's a seat, come take it. It's about saying, oh, you've historically been disenfranchised. You've historically been, put in a position where you can't make it to the seat. We can't just now open up the seat and say, why aren't you sitting down? We have to make sure that all of those barriers go away. And that in the meantime, we're actually doing a lot of elevation, empowering, things of that nature. Narissa, I've learned so much from you. There's so much more about your research. I'm going to link to the incredible work that you're doing in the show notes so that people can dive deeper into what you're doing and what some of your findings have been, and they can see your articles and some of the things that you've written about this. Unfortunately, I've kept you so long, and I have like a whole other podcast I now have to record. And you're coming at me. What time is it in the Falklands right now? By the way, it's 4:00 here.
Oh, so it's just after 8 p.m.
Oh, right, because we're vertically aligned pretty much. On that note, I close my show by asking all of my guests the same two questions, and I'm just really curious to hear how you answer them. So I was hoping that we could maybe close out with those two big picture questions.
Sure.
Okay, so here we go. So when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you, obviously it could be contextualized in the work that you do and in the way that you, the perspective shifts that you've experienced throughout your career, but even in something more personal as well. Number one, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned, worried about, maybe even a little bit pessimistic about? And then on the flip side of that, where are you finding genuine optimism and hope?
Yeah, I imagine that the two things are quite combined. I'm probably going to go with climate change for the first part of it. And not necessarily that, because climate change is such a big, unwieldy thing to talk about, but the consequences of it. And so that idea, I think that we did talk about throughout the interview a little bit of what we can lose as a consequence, and without, we not even, especially in the deep sea, not necessarily recognizing what we've lost already before species are described. You've already, before we explore those habitats, that sort of thing. But also intertwined with that would be that I feel like we live in a very beautiful, biodiverse, incredible world, and we have so much that, and not just in terms of the ecosystems, but also in terms of the information that's now available to us, the broader network of researchers and Indigenous scholars and people all over the world that are invested in positive change for the future. From the ocean side of things, there is a larger collaborative effort over the next 10 years. And, maybe as cheesy as it sounds, I did put forward for myself when this was coming around that I wanted to do what I could whilst we have the time. And I feel like if people get on board with that, then we can. And we also have seen some really interesting capacity for governments to change, for individuals to change recently. So it's hard right now, but it's still quite hopeful, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's I think an inspiring thing to hold on to. I think that it's important for many of us to hear from the people who do have those boots on the ground that there is hope, that even though that you're in the thick of it, that you are seeing the consequences every day, that you also see a path forward and a path, maybe not out, but a path through. And I think that that's something that at least I personally need in my life to help me hold on to that hope as well. So I really appreciate your sharing that with us today. And I also, I appreciate you just being here. I know it's been a bear of a time for us to be able to get connected because, of course, you're like in one of the remotest parts of our planet. But I'm glad that we had a solid internet and that we were able to meet up today and that you were able to share your perspective with us. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much, Cara. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.